The first time a man tells you exactly what you are worth, believe him, because Damien Ferraro told me I was worth nothing, and he said it with a smile. That afternoon I had spent an hour pressing the collar of my one good dress, a plum-colored thing I bought on sale for $40, and I remember smoothing it over my knees under the Ferraro dining table as if the fabric could make me belong there. The table was longer than my first apartment. 12 chairs, white orchids down the center, silver that caught the candlelight and threw it back at me like a warning. I had cared for this family's grandmother for 14 months. I knew the back staircases and the sound the old house made at 3 in the morning, the way the pipes ticked and the lake wind found the gaps in the windows. I did not know how to sit at their front table. Damien found my hand under the cloth, and for one breath I let myself believe the thing he had promised me on the lake dock a week before, that tonight he would tell them all he meant to marry me. His father sat at the head of the table. Don Salvatore Ferraro. Silver at the temples, a stillness to him that made grown men lower their voices without knowing why. He had spoken maybe 10 words to me in 14 months, and every one had been about his mother's medicine, delivered flat, over his newspaper, without once looking up. Across from me sat a woman I had never met, Vittoria Costa, in a dress the color of a wound, her father beside her, both of them watching Damien the way buyers watch a horse at auction. I should have understood it then. A glass ring. Damien stood. He straightened his jacket, and when he smiled at the room something in my stomach went cold, because it was not the smile he gave me in the dark. I know there has been talk, he said, about the help, about me and the nurse. The word help landed on me like a hand across the face. Let me put it to rest. He looked down at me the way you look at a stain on a shirt you were going to throw out anyway. Simone is nobody, he said. She empties bedpans and counts pills. You do not marry the woman who wipes your grandmother's chin. You thank her and you show her the door. Somebody laughed. Aunt Gloria, 3 seats down, pressed a napkin to her mouth as if she had tasted something sweet. Vittoria's father smiled into his wine. And I sat there in my $40 dress with my hands folded in my lap, and I did not cry, because the women who raised me taught me that your face is the last thing they can take from you, so you keep it no matter what. I looked at Damien and I searched for the man who had held my hand on the dock, and he was simply gone, as if he had never truly been mine to lose, as if the version of him I loved had been rented by the hour, and the hour was up. Say something, Gloria said, delighted, leaning forward on her elbows. The girl has gone deaf. The table waited for me to break. I could feel it, the way a room leans toward a person it expects to shatter. I set my napkin beside my plate. I stood. My chair scraped the floor, the loudest sound I have ever made in my life, and I let it be loud. Thank you for dinner, I said, and my voice did not shake, and to this day I have never been prouder of anything I have done. I turned to leave that dining room and its 12 chairs and its orchids and its silver, and I made it exactly 4 steps toward the door, close enough to see the brass handle catch the light. That was when I heard it. Down at the head of the table, slow and deliberate, the Don set his glass on the wood. He did not raise his voice. He never raises his voice. But the sound of that crystal touching that table stopped the whole room the way a gunshot never could, and every laugh died in every throat at once. Sit down, he said. Not to me. To his son. Damien's smile flickered like a bulb about to die, and he lowered himself back into his chair without seeming to decide to. The Don did not look at him. He was looking down the length of that long table, past the candles and the flowers and all those staring faces, and he was looking at me, and it was not the way you look at a nurse, and it was not the way you look at the help. It was the way a man looks at something he has been quietly measuring for a very long time and has just finished counting. The room held its breath. And in a voice meant only for that room, without heat, without hurry, Don Salvatore Ferraro said, "Before anyone leaves this house tonight, I have something to say about worth," and I stood frozen 4 steps from the door, unable to leave. Unable to guess that my whole life had just turned on the sound of a glass. Nobody moved. 12 people at a table built for a kingdom, and not one of them dared reach for a fork. Don Salvatore did not stand. He simply folded his hands on the white cloth, and I watched every face at that table rearrange itself around his silence, the way iron filings turn when you move a magnet under the paper. Then the moment cracked, because Aunt Gloria laughed again, brighter and more nervous this time, and said, "Oh, Sal, do not embarrass the boy over a servant. It is his engagement dinner," and the spell broke, and the Don let it break. He said nothing more. He rose, buttoned his jacket, and walked out of his own dinner without touching his plate, and I understood that whatever he had been about to say, he had decided in that instant that we were not worthy of hearing it, that we had spent the moment, all of us, and it would not come again. So I was left standing in the doorway with the whole family staring, and the shame came then, late and hot, crawling up my neck and into my ears. Damien would not look at me. Vittoria looked at me too much, a small pleased smile on her mouth as she slid into the seat beside him, my seat, the one his hand had been under a minute before. I walked out. The main hallway of that house is 90 feet long and hung with portraits of dead Ferraro men in heavy frames, and I walked all 90 feet of it hearing my own heels on the wood and their low laughter drifting behind me like smoke. And I promised myself I would be packed and gone before the sun came up. I did not get to keep that promise. I had my duffel half full, my $40 dress folded on top, when a knock came, soft, and Mrs. Alvarez, the housekeeper who had trained me on my first day, stood in my doorway with her hands twisted in her apron. "You cannot leave," she whispered, glancing back down the hall. "Rosa, the old woman will not take her evening pills from anyone else. She threw the whole tray at the new girl and started crying for you. The doctor says her heart cannot take that kind of upset, not twice in one night." I sat down on the edge of the bed with a folded blouse in my lap. Down the hall, faint through two closed doors, I could hear Nonna Rosa calling a name into the dark, over and over, and the name she was calling was mine. The next morning the Don's lawyer found me in the sunroom, spooning oatmeal into Rosa a little at a time. He did not sit down. He said the family would prefer I stay on until Rosa's care could be, and he searched a moment for the word, transitioned. There would be a bonus for my discretion. There would be a good reference. He said it all without once meeting my eyes, the way you talk to a piece of furniture you are apologizing to a room for keeping. I looked at Rosa, who had a smear of oatmeal on her chin and both of her hands wrapped around my wrist like a child clinging to a dock, and I said yes, and I hated how simple it was for them to buy back the very thing they had called worthless the night before. So I stayed. I became a ghost in a house that suddenly had a wedding to plan. Vittoria's people arrived with fabric swatches and clipboards and moved through the hall's measuring windows that were not theirs yet, holding up samples of ivory and champagne against the light. I heard the word merger far more often than I heard the word love, and something about that word snagged in me like a hook and would not pull loose. I kept my head down. I gave Rosa her pills at 8 and her heart drops at noon, and I read to her every afternoon from the same water-swollen paperback, because it was the only book she still remembered, the only story that made her smile in the right places. And I told myself none of it touched me anymore, that I had gone numb, that numb was a mercy. That lasted until the 4th evening, when I carried a tea tray past the library and found the door open 2 inches, and I heard Damien's voice through the gap, low and tight in a way I had never once heard from him in all our months together, saying, "He does not suspect anything, my father is halfway to the grave already, we just keep everything smooth until after." And then a second voice answered, a stranger's, cold and amused and older, a voice used to being obeyed, and it said, "Then we keep the girl exactly where she is until it is done." I stopped in the middle of that 90-foot hallway with a tray of cooling tea in my hands, and the cups did not even rattle, because I understood 2 things at the same time and both of them turned my blood to ice water. They were talking about Don Salvatore. And in a plan I could not yet see the shape of, for a reason I could not begin to guess, they were also talking about me. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the narrow servant's bed and turned that one sentence over and over until the words wore smooth as river stones. We keep the girl exactly where she is, and no matter how I held it up to the light, I could not make it mean anything good. In the morning I told myself I had heard it wrong. Grief and shame will make a person hear plots in a tea kettle, will turn an overheard nothing into a knife. So I did the thing I have always done when the ground moves under me. I worked. I bathed Rosa's swollen feet in warm water and Epsom salt. I pinned her hair the way she liked it. One silver wave lifted off her forehead, and I wheeled her out to the east terrace where the light comes soft and gold off the lake in the early hours. And that is where the Don found us. He came around the tall hedge with no bodyguard and no phone in his hand, holding 2 cups of coffee, and he set one down on the little iron table beside me without a word, as though the 2 of us did this every single morning of our lives. I did not know what to do with my hands. He looked at his mother, who was dozing upright in the sun with her chin dropped, and after a long while he said, "She sleeps now. She has not truly slept since my wife died. That was 3 years ago this spring." I said the only true thing I had in me. "She likes the sound of the water." He turned and looked at me then, really looked, the same way he had looked down the length of that table the night before, unhurried, complete. "My son called you nobody," he said. I kept my eyes on Rosa's sleeping face. "It is not the worst thing I have been called," I said, and it was the truth. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And yet you stayed." It was not a question, so I did not answer it as one. "She asked for me," I said. "That is all it is." And the Don did something I had never seen him do in 14 months under his roof. He almost smiled. It touched the corners of his eyes and left again before it ever reached his mouth, but I caught it. Loyalty to a person who can never pay you back, he said, watching his mother breathe, is the rarest thing I know of in this world. My son has never once understood it. Most of the people who eat at my table do not understand it either. He picked up his own coffee and stood there in the morning light, a powerful man in an unpressed shirt with his sleeves shoved up, and for the first time in all those months I did not feel like a function in that house, a set of hands that came with the furniture. I felt like a person he had decided, for reasons of his own, to see. He came the next morning too. And the one after that. He never stayed long, and he never touched me, and he never once offered a soft word, but he learned how I took my coffee and he started bringing the newspaper already folded to the crossword. Because Rosa liked me to read her the clues out loud and let her be right about the easy ones. It was such a small thing, that folded paper waiting on the iron table. And it undid something in me I had bolted shut and welded over the night of the dinner. I began, against every ounce of my better sense, to hope. And that is the dangerous part of any story, the hoping, because hope makes you lift your head, and the moment you lift your head you start to see things you were safe for not seeing. On the 6th morning, wheeling Rosa back inside out of a cold wind, I saw the thing I was never meant to see. Damien's study door stood open. He had been called into the city before dawn. I had heard the car, and on his desk, half slid beneath a leather blotter, sat a ledger and a stack of documents stamped with a red wax seal I recognized. Because I had seen that exact seal on Aldo Costa's briefcase the night he smiled at me across the wine. I should have kept walking. 14 months of keeping my head down and my eyes on my own work told me to keep walking, to be the invisible thing they all believed I was. Instead, I stopped. I looked back down the long empty hallway, both directions, and I heard nothing but the grandfather clock. And I stepped into that room, and I lifted the corner of that blotter with 2 fingers, and I read the words printed across the top of the first page, and my blood went to water where I stood. It was a transfer of the entire Ferraro holdings, every account, every property, every name, dated for the day after the wedding. And the man signing his own father's empire out from under him, the signature already inked at the bottom in a hand I knew, was not Salvatore. It was Damien. I put the blotter back down exactly as it had been, corner to corner, and I stepped out of that study and pulled the door to its original 2 inches. I remember that my hands were perfectly steady, and that frightened me more than shaking ever could have. Because it meant some cold and ancient part of me had already understood I was in real danger, and had gone very quiet and very careful in order to keep me alive. I wheeled Rosa to her room. I gave her the noon drops, counting them into the spoon out of pure habit while my mind ran. And then I sat down on the floor with my back against the side of her bed, and I did the arithmetic of everything I had just read. 3 weeks until the wedding. A transfer of the whole empire the day after. A father who suspected nothing, who brought me coffee and folded the crossword while his son sold the ground out from under him. And a son who does not sign his own family away unless the water is already up over his mouth, unless someone has him by the throat. Rosa's hand came down off the bed and rested on the top of my head, light as a leaf. The lucid moments came to her like sudden breaks in fog, and in one of them she looked down at me and said, clear as a struck bell, "My grandson keeps bad friends, Simone. He has kept bad friends since he was a small boy. He always believes the fox is his brother." And then the fog rolled back over her eyes, and she asked me sweetly whether it was time for the crossword yet. That afternoon Vittoria found me alone in the linen room, folding pillowcases. She was beautiful up close in a way that had nothing warm anywhere in it, like good silver left out in the cold, and she leaned against the door frame and studied me as though I were a stain she had not yet decided was worth the trouble of removing. "You have been in this house a long time," she said. "That is a great many hallways to walk. A great many doors." I kept folding and said nothing at all. "A smart woman," she went on, examining her own nails, "always knows which doors were never hers to open, and keeps her hands to herself." Then she pushed off the frame and crossed the small room until she was close enough that I could smell her perfume, expensive and cold as the lake in November, and she said, very softly, almost kindly, "Damien tells me you are loyal. I do hope you are loyal to your own future, Simone. Nurses take ill too. Even young ones." Then she smiled at me, a warm and terrible smile, and she walked away down the hall, and I stood in that linen room holding a half-folded pillowcase and understood that I had just been threatened in a voice sweet enough to sing a child to sleep. I did not sleep again after that. Every sound the old house made at 3 in the morning became a footstep in the hall. Every ticking pipe became a hand on my door. I thought seriously about running. I had $600 in a coffee can and a duffel bag, and not one person left in the whole world who depended on me, except a forgetful old woman who called my name into the dark when the house frightened her. And that, God forgive me, was the exact thing that would not let me leave. Because if I ran, they would bring in some stranger to hand Rosa her heart drops, someone who did not know she took them at noon and not at 11, someone who did not know her heart could not survive a fright. And if the plan was truly what I feared it was, then Rosa, who had watched too much and remembered too little, was precisely the sort of loose thread that men like Aldo Costa tie off before it can unravel them. I could not carry the Don's war for him. He had let his own son burn me alive in front of that whole family and had walked out of the room rather than finish his sentence. I told myself I owed him nothing, and it was true. But I would not, leave that old woman to the foxes. So I made a smaller and far more dangerous choice than running. I decided to stay and to watch. I decided to be exactly the invisible, worthless nurse they all believed me to be, and to keep my eyes open, and to learn what a signature dated the day after a wedding was really going to cost. I lasted 2 days before the danger came looking for me first. On the third night, long after the house had gone black and silent, Rosa's call button lit up on the panel beside my door. 3 sharp buzzes, and then nothing, and when I ran the full 90 feet of that hallway in my bare feet and shoved open her door. Her bed was empty, the window stood wide to the cold coming off the lake, and her wheelchair sat abandoned and turned at the very top of the servants' stairs. I did not scream. Screaming brings people running, and in that moment I did not yet know which people in that house were mine, and which belonged to the foxes. I checked the stairs first, both flights, my heart slamming so hard I could feel it in my teeth, praying I would not find her broken at the bottom, and she was not there, thank God, she was not anywhere on those stairs at all. I found her by the sound of her. Down on the first landing, folded into the shadowed alcove where the tall grandfather clock stands, Rosa was sitting on the cold floor in her thin nightgown with her knees drawn up to her chest, humming. She had gotten herself out of the chair alone, which 3 separate doctors had sworn to me she could no longer do, and she had traveled the one dark corner of that entire house that frightened me most. And there she sat humming an old lullaby in Italian to no one at all. I knelt on the floor in front of her. Her skin was cold as the window pane, and her lips had gone the exact blue-gray color I had spent my whole nursing life learning to dread, and her pulse under my 2 fingers was a small bird throwing itself again and again at a closed window. "Nana," I said, keeping my voice low and even. "Rosa, look at me now." Her eyes swam a moment, and then found my face. "Mama," she said. And I did not correct her. I learned a long time ago that you do not correct them, you do not drag them back to a present that terrifies them, you simply go to wherever they are and you meet them there. So I became her mother. I sat all the way down on that freezing floor and I gathered all 81 pounds of her up into my lap the way I once gathered my own mother in the last spring of her life, and I wrapped my robe around the both of us. And I put my mouth close to her cold ear and I hummed the only song I had in me, the one my own mother used to hum to me, and I rocked her slowly, side to side. I rubbed the warmth back into her hands 1 finger at a time. I told her over and over that she was safe now, that I had her, that no one on this earth was going to take her anywhere, and I meant every single word of it more than I have ever meant anything I have said. My mother died in a county hospital with a paper curtain for a wall, and I was 19 years old, and I held her hand through it, and I was so frightened that my teeth chattered. And I made a promise to her ghost in that room that no one would ever die frightened and alone while I still had 2 working hands to stop it from happening. So I was not only holding Rosa on that landing in the dark. I was holding a promise 14 years old, and I was holding the girl I had been at 19, and I was holding my own mother, all of it at once, rocking on a cold floor beside a ticking clock. Slowly, her pulse began to settle under my fingers. Her breathing stretched and deepened. The terrible blue drained out of her lips and a little color came back. She reached up with 1 paper-thin hand and laid it flat against my cheek and said, in a voice suddenly clear and certain, "You came." And I said, "I will always come." And I did not know, kneeling there, that I was not the only person listening. I felt it before I saw it, the way you feel the temperature of a room change when a door opens somewhere behind you. I looked up toward the top of the landing. Don Salvatore stood there in his shirt sleeves, 1 hand gripping the banister. I do not know how long he had been standing in that dark. Long enough. He was not moving at all. This was a man who commanded whole families with nothing but the quiet setting down of a wine glass, and he stood frozen on his own staircase, with his jaw working as though something deep inside him had come loose from its moorings. He had heard me become his mother's mother in the dark. He had watched a woman his son called worthless sit down on a cold stone floor, in the middle of the night, for a person who could never repay her and would not even remember her name by morning. After a long moment he came down the stairs slowly, 1 hand still on the rail. And then this powerful, dangerous man lowered himself all the way down onto the floor of that alcove with us, and he took his mother's other hand in both of his, And for a while the three of us simply sat there together beside the ticking clock and no one said a single word. When he finally spoke, he looked at me over the white head of the woman we were both holding, and his eyes were wet, and he said, very low so as not to wake her, everyone I have ever known has wanted something from me. He stopped and steadied himself. 14 years of foxes, he said, and I have never once seen a soul kneel on a cold floor for nothing at all. Take her up now, and know that I will not forget this. We carried her up together, the Dawn and I, his big hands surprisingly gentle beneath her frail shoulders while I managed her legs, and when she was warm again and dosed, and finally sleeping soundly, he stood a moment in her doorway and said, only my study. Tomorrow, 10 o'clock, and then he was gone down the dark hall. I never made it to study the next morning. I never got the chance, because by the next morning everything had already begun to move. Rosa woke lucid. Not fog lucid. Not a brief break in the clouds, but clear all the way down to the bottom, the way she had been in the very first months I knew her, and she caught my wrist while I was fixing her tea and she said, Simone, sit down. I do not have long before it goes again and I need you to listen to every word. I sat. She told me she was not nearly as blind as they all believed her to be. She told me she had watched her grandson change over the last year, watched the strange cars come up the drive at odd hours, watched Aldo Costa come and go through the kitchen door like a thief who already held the deed to the place. And then she told me the thing that stopped the breath in my chest. On the nights when the fog is thick, she said, they talk in front of me as if I am a lamp, as if I am part of the wall. 3 nights ago Damien and that Costa man stood at the foot of my bed and I heard every word, and they said, the old woman is the only one who can undo it. They said, if she ever tells Salvatore what she put her name to, the whole thing comes apart in our hands. Rosa's grip tightened on my wrist until it hurt. They put a paper in front of me months ago. Child, she said. My grandson held my hand and told me it was for my medicine, for the family trust, and I signed it because I trusted his face, because I have loved that face since it was 3 days old, and I have been sick with fear ever since that I signed my own son away. Then she pressed something small and hard into my palm and closed my fingers over it. A little brass key, worn smooth with age. The blue box, she whispered, in my closet, behind all the shoes at the back. My husband's papers are in it. And a copy of every single thing I have ever put my name to in this house. You get that box to Salvatore. Not to anyone else. Not to the lawyer is theirs, bought and paid for. Only to my son, do you hear me, only to Salvatore. And then her eyes clouded over, and the fog came rolling back in like a tide, and she looked at me sweetly and asked whether it might be time for the crossword now, and the single clearest hour I would ever be given from her was over and gone. I have never in my life moved so carefully. I waited until the house had emptied for the day, Damien gone to the city, Vittoria out at another fitting, Mrs. Alvarez sent to the market. Then I went into that closet and got down on my knees and pushed aside 40 years of shoes until my fingers found the cold corner of a metal box shoved against the back wall. The little brass key turned with a click. And inside was everything. The original trust, thick and formal and sealed. The forged transfer with its false figures. And a single page in Rosa's own shaking hand, signed, dated, and witnessed by the parish priest, stating plainly that she had been deceived into signing what she signed. It was enough to burn the entire plan to the ground and salt the earth it stood on. I slid all of it into my nursing bag, tucked flat beneath the blood pressure cuff and the box of gloves, and I stood up, and I turned around to leave. Vittoria was standing in the bedroom doorway. She was not supposed to be home for hours. She looked, slowly, at the open closet with its scattered shoes. She looked at the corner of the blue metal box still visible in my bag. And that cold, beautiful, still face of hers went even stiller, and she said, in the christening sweet voice she used for her worst things, you know, I told Damien weeks ago that we should have replaced you. He said you were too useful with the old woman. She stepped fully into the room and reached back and pushed the door shut behind her, and I heard the lock turn over with a small final sound, and I stood there with the fortune in evidence in my bag and understood there was nowhere left in that room for me to go. I had exactly one advantage in that locked room, and it was the very thing they had been holding against me since the first night at the dinner table. They believed I was nothing. Vittoria stood there fully expecting me to beg, or to bargain, or to burst into tears, and while she waited for me to do one of those small and breakable things, I set my nursing bag down on the bed as calmly as if a locked door were a thing that happened to me every day of my life, and I said, Rosa's noon heart drops are due in 15 minutes. If she does not get them on time, and her heart stops, there will be a coroner walking through this house before dark, and coroners ask a great many questions, and I am the only person under this roof qualified to sign that what happened to her was natural. You do not want me discovered locked inside a bedroom on the same day, Vittoria. Think. It was a bluff built entirely on the truth, which is the only kind that holds any weight, and I watched it land behind her eyes. She did not know enough medicine to call it, and that single flicker of doubt was all the room I needed. I picked my bag back up. I walked to the door. And I said, unlock it now, or I start screaming loud enough to bring Mrs. Alvarez and every soul on this floor running, and then you can be the one to explain the blue box and the open closet to all of them. Her jaw went tight and white at the corners. But she reached back, and she turned the lock. I walked past her close enough to feel the heat of her hatred, and I did not run, because worthless women do not run. They simply finish what they came to do and they leave, and so I left. I did not go to my room. I went straight down the back stairs and out across the lawn to the boathouse at the water's edge, where I knew the Don took his morning coffee alone when he wanted to think, and I found him there. And I put the cold blue box directly into his hands, and I told him all of it, start to finish, leaving nothing out. He did not interrupt me once. He read Rosa's shaking signature on the priest-witnessed page. He read the forged transfer with its false numbers. He read the trust his own son had tried to gut. And I watched a man I had believed was beyond the reach of any surprise slowly learn that his own child had sold him to his enemies. And then he told me the one thing that turned the whole story over on its head. I know, Simone, he said quietly, still looking down at the papers. I have known for 2 months now. His men had flagged the Costa money moving in strange patterns months ago. He had known for certain that there was a plan. What he had not known, what he could not find out no matter how he watched, was who inside his own house still had a spine and who had already been bought. So he had waited. He had let the dinner happen, he said, and for the first time a shadow of real shame crossed his face as he said it. He had let his son humiliate me in front of everyone, and he had done nothing. Because he needed to see who I would become when I had every reason on earth to run and every right in the world to betray him for what he had allowed. He had needed to know whether the loyalty he thought he saw on the terrace was the real thing, or whether I was only one more fox wearing a kinder face than the rest. The night on the cold landing had answered the first half of his question. Rosa's brass key had just answered the other half. I have spent 30 years, he said, setting the box down on the bench, unable to tell the people who want my chair from the people who want me in the ground. And a nurse in a $40 dress has just handed me both of them at once and asked me for nothing in return. He looked up at me. Why, he said. After what my son did to you in front of my entire family, after what I let him do, why did you bring this to me instead of selling it to them? And I told him the plain and complete truth. Because I made a promise a long time ago, to my mother, that no one would die frightened and alone while I could stop it, and your mother is not going to end up a loose thread for those men to cut. This was never about your empire, Don Salvatore. Not for 1 second. It was always about her. He was silent for a long time, watching the light move on the water. Then he stood, and he buttoned his jacket. That small deliberate gesture I had come to understand meant a decision had been reached and would not be unmade. The anniversary dinner is this Saturday, he said. The whole family. The Costas. Damien. All of them at one table. He looked out at the lake. Wear the plum dress, he said. And this time, Simone, whatever you hear me say, do not leave the room. Saturday came, and I wore the plum dress. 12 chairs. White orchids down the center. The same silver throwing back the same candlelight and the same faces that had laughed at me a month before now glancing at me and quickly away, unsettled, because I did not come in through the kitchen door this time carrying anyone's tray. I came in on Don Salvatore's arm. He walked me the length of that long room, and he seated me in the chair at his own right hand, the chair that had stood empty since his wife died 3 years before, and I watched the meaning of it move around that table like cold water spreading across a floor. Damien's face. Vittoria's face. Aldo Costa going very still with his glass halfway to his lips. Aunt Gloria's napkin forgotten in her hand. The Don let them all look. He let the silence stretch out long and thin until it was the only thing left in the room that anyone could hear, and this is the thing the men who fear Salvatore Ferraro understand in their bones, and his own son never once learned. That the man does his cruelest and most final work with his voice low and his hands folded quietly on the cloth in front of him. When at last he spoke, he did not shout. He never shouts. He said, 3 nights from tonight, a transfer of this entire family was set to be signed, a document that would hand everything my father, and I built to a man sitting at this table who does not carry the name Ferraro. He did not turn to look at the Costas. He did not need to. He reached down beside his chair, and he lifted the worn blue box and set it on the white cloth in the light of the candles. My mother, he said, was deceived into signing it. My son signed it knowing exactly what it was. And then he turned in his chair to face Damien directly, and in front of the whole family, in the same room, at the same table where it had been done to me, he gave his son back his own words one at a time. You stood in this room, he said, and you told this family that a person's worth is only what they can do for you. You called a woman nobody because she counts pills and wipes an old woman's chin. He let that hang in the air a moment. Damien, he said, in 14 months that nobody never once lied to me, never once took a thing that was not hers, and knelt on a cold floor in the middle of the night for a woman who cannot remember her own name by morning. You share my blood, and you sold it to my enemies for money. She has not one drop of my blood, and she guarded it with her life and asked me for nothing. He reached out and picked up his glass. Not to drink from it. He simply set it back down on the wood, that same small ring of crystal against oak that had frozen the entire room the first night, and every single person at that table flinched at the sound and the memory it carried. So let me finish now, he said, what you did not permit me to finish the last time we all sat here. As of tonight, my son inherits nothing from me. Not the trust, not the holdings, not the accounts, not the name. Nothing. And then he turned to me, and down the length of that long candlelit table, in front of every face that had watched me shamed and shown the door, Don Salvatore Ferraro said the words that ended one story and began the whole of another. This woman, he said, the one my son called worthless, is my heir. Nobody laughed this time. Nobody made a sound. Aldo Costa began to rise from his seat, and two of the Don's men stepped forward from the wall where they had been standing, unhurried, and Costa sat slowly back down without a word. Damien looked at me across the table, and for one single second the boy from the lake dock was there in his eyes, drowning, reaching, and then he was gone under for good. The Don did not have him touched. That is not how the truly powerful ever punish, and it took me until that night to understand it. He simply let the entire family sit and watch a son become no one at all, at the exact table where he had made me into no one, and there is no fist ever thrown in the history of the world that lands the way that silence landed. And I did not gloat. I sat in the plum dress with my hands folded in my lap, the very way I had sat the night they broke me, and I let the quiet finish its work, and I understood at last that real justice does not roar or bleed. It sets down a glass, and it waits. Justice is a single evening. Everything that comes after it is the rest of your life, and that is the part no one ever warns you about, because it is so much quieter and it takes so much longer to build. Damien was gone by Monday morning. There was no scene, no raised voices, nothing to watch. His father gave him a single suitcase and a bank number that was neither generous nor cruel, and the tall iron gate swung shut behind his car as it went down the drive, and that was the entire end of it. The Costas unwound their business from ours over the following months, slowly and carefully, the way a person backs away from a fire without turning their back on it, and Aldo Costa never once crossed the Ferraro threshold again as long as I knew that house. Vittoria's fabric swatches vanished from the halls overnight. The windows she had measured for curtains that would never hang stayed exactly as they had always been. And I, who had first come into that house for no greater purpose than to hand an old woman her pills on time, woke one ordinary morning to find that I had become the person the whole household now brought its questions to. And I will not pretend to you that I knew what to do with that, or that I did it gracefully at first. I made mistakes. I trusted a supplier I should not have trusted, and it cost us. I misjudged a man's smile. I learned, slowly, the way you learn anything worth knowing, by getting it wrong and paying for it and getting it right the next time. Salvatore taught me the difference between being feared and being respected, which he said most men in his world die without ever once understanding, and I taught him, without ever setting out to, how to sit still in a room and simply be present with a person who wanted absolutely nothing from him. We were careful with each other, the two of us. Whatever it was that grew up between us grew the way the strongest and slowest things grow, out of that morning coffee on the terrace, and that folded crossword, and a promise kept on a cold stone landing in the dark, and I will only tell you this much of it, that a widower who had not truly slept in 3 long years began at last to sleep through the night, and a woman who had been named nobody in front of the entire world began, quietly and without any announcement, to feel like somebody in the warm privacy of her own life. We did not rush a single moment of it. We never once needed to say it out loud to know that it was the truest thing either of us had ever been handed. But the still, warm center of all of it, from the first day to the last, was always Rosa. She never fully came back to us after that night on the landing. The fog took a little more of her with each turning season, the way it always does in the end, and there were mornings she called me Mama and mornings she called me nothing at all and simply watched the light on the water. It did not matter to me, not once. I gave her the noon drops. I pinned the one silver wave up off her forehead the way she liked it. I read her the crossword clues aloud every afternoon and let her be right about all of them, the hard ones too. And on the good, warm days I wheeled her chair out to the east terrace where the light comes soft and gold off the lake, and Salvatore would come around the tall hedge carrying 3 cups of coffee instead of 2, and we would sit there together, the 3 of us, saying very little. And I finally came to understand what the word family had been trying to mean my whole life, and how little of it had ever had anything to do with blood. On the last warm evening of that first autumn, there was a dinner. No merger this time. No announcement, no strangers, no orchids ordered in for show. Only the household, and the long table, and the old silver catching the candlelight the way it always had. Salvatore stood at the head of the table where he had stood every night of his life. But it was not his hand that reached out and pulled back the chair beside him. It was Rosa's hand, small and shaking and completely certain, patting the seat of the chair, saying, "Sit, child, sit here by me." And I sat down in the chair that had once not been mine to so much as want, at the table where I had once been told to my face that I did not belong, and no one seated at it thought a single thing of it, because it had become, simply and finally, my place. I thought about the girl standing in that doorway in the $40 dress, for steps from the exit, keeping her face, because it was the last thing they had not managed to take from her. I wished I could reach all the way back through that long year and tell her to hold on just a little longer. Your worth was never theirs to hand out, I would tell her. It was never once up for a vote at their table. One day a powerful man is going to try to give it to you like a crown in front of everyone, and you are going to smile and let him do it, but you will already know the truth by then, that you never lost it, not for one single second. Not even standing 4 steps from that door. Rosa's hand found mine on the white cloth and held on. The lake moved slow and dark and patient beyond the windows. And for the first time in a very long time, I was not a ghost drifting through anyone else's house. I was home,